Tilbage i 2005, der modtog næste forfatter her på scenen, han modtog Nordisk Råds litteraturpris for en roman, der kun havde én fejl, set med mine øjne, og det var, at den var 116 sider lang. Og færdig, før man overhovedet var færdig med den. Nu har han i den grad taget revanche med en mastodont, en trilogi, som står her på scenen, CoDex 1962. En fantastisk bog, som jeg på det varmeste kan anbefale folk at læse. Det er sådan en, man forelsker sig stærkt i fra allerførste sætning. Den næste samtale kommer til at foregå på engelsk. Det håber jeg, I er indforstået med. Tag rigtig godt imod Kim Skotte i samtale med Sjón.
Yes, welcome everybody. And especially welcome to you, Sjón, of course.
Thank you.
Great pleasure to be welcoming you here on behalf of myself and this fantastic book you've written here.
Well,
I think we should start out by talking very fundamentally about the book, so that people will know a little about what we're talking about. This is a book in 3 parts, and maybe you could just explain why is it in 3 parts and how did it come about? Because it's got quite a long history of gestation, this book.
yes. Yes. It is, I'd call it a novel in 3 books. And sometimes it's called a trilogy, which it is as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I wrote the first book and published the first book in 1994 in Iceland. And the second volume was published 7 years later in 2001, and then the last one in 2016. So it is a literary work that spans most of my adult career as an author. I started as a teenage surrealist poet.
Yeah.
So I had that before I became like a novelist. And one of the reasons it is 3 books is that the whole work is about the world of stories, is about the belief in stories, is a celebration of all the different forms of stories. So the first book is a love story. The second book is a crime story. The third book is a science fiction story. And within those 3 books and within the whole thing, you have a celebration of folk stories, of dreams, of metaphysical stories, of comedies, of everything. So the main character of the book, his name is Josef Löwe. He is a young man living in Reykjavik in 2012. I say young because he is born in 1962, like myself, and he is 50 at the time of the of the telling of the whole story. So he is an isolated man living in Reykjavik. He is very much aware of the fact that he is on the way out of this world. He's got a very rare disease or a syndrome where his bones are slowly fossilizing and growing in strange ways, and he knows that his days are limited. So he gets a rare opportunity of telling his story when a woman who is doing a survey for a genealogical company in Iceland, where they are researching the lives of people born in 1962, he gets the rare chance of telling his story. Nobody seems to have visited him ever. So when this woman shows up on his doorstep with a 1-page questionnaire, he uses the opportunity to tell not only his life story, but the life story of his father and his mother.
And humankind.
And the beginning of the human race, and possibly the end of the human race, and everything that happens in between.
Yeah.
And he is so afraid of losing her attention, because of course he knows that he is using this opportunity, like, you know, or let's say he's taking advantage of this opportunity. So he starts telling the story, and he's so afraid that she will just say, well, you know, the time is up, you know, and I have to leave. Yeah. That he takes, he uses every trick ever discovered by a storyteller to keep the audience listening.
So there is this metaphor of the writer and the reader somehow embedded in this setup.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because, I mean, the greatest fear of a storyteller is the same greatest fear a writing author has, and that is, of course, that the reader will close the book on page 3. You know, like, no, not for me.
Yeah.
You know. So you have to keep the reader at it, you know. And if you sense that the reader is losing interest, then, of course, you open the little bag of stories and you say, and there the knight decided to have a break on his journey and cooked himself a simple meal. And as he was cooking his simple meal, he heard the song of birds in the trees. And he realized that he could understand what they were singing about. And then you get a whole different story that is maybe a little bit more exciting than the story that you're really telling, you know. But if you've told that story well, you've earned a few more minutes from the reader for the story that you're telling. So the book is full of those tricks, you know. Yeah.
Small life and death tricks of the storyteller.
Yes.
Do you think, being from Iceland, you got a special knack for this? Because one thing is to be a modern writer, and you have to put out your books, and it's a market with a lot of competing writers, and of course you have to get their attention. But at the same time, it seems to me like you in Iceland have a sort of a closer relationship to the spinning of the yarn. This whole thing that you have that there is you are authors who write books, but also teller of stories, spinning the yarns. You have to keep the attention of people, unless you're put inside the same cabin, of course.
Yes, I think, you know, I think we are quite close to the world of storytelling as it was before the advent of the printed book and the modern novel. Yeah. If we say that the modern novel started in the 18th century, more or less, you know, it took off then. At that time, there was no literature like that in Iceland. The novel, as we know it, the modern novel and the printed novel is a relatively new thing in Iceland, which may come as a surprise because we are always boasting of being the great literary nation with an unbroken tradition of literature since the 11th, 12th century.
Yeah, king of the sagas.
Kings of the sagas and all that, and we are. You know, okay. You know,
make no mistake.
I'm not going to say that we aren't, but in the 18th, 19th century and well into the 20th century, there was no infrastructure in Iceland that supported novel writing, as you saw being born in other countries. So the modern novel is really something that comes into being in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and into the 3rd decade. Icelandic writers who wanted to have a real career in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they moved to Denmark. And they wrote in Danish. Because that was the only way of being a professional writer. There was no way of being a professional writer in Iceland. And I think it means that a certain part of Icelandic literature, certain tradition in Icelandic literature, contemporary literature, starts with them. And what they were doing was that they were looking at the European novel, they were looking at the Danish novel, and they were trying to imitate it with an Icelandic setting, you know. Then the amazing thing happens. Nobody knew it at the time that it was amazing, but it was the decision by one man to write in Icelandic, and that was Halldór Laxness, who later received the Nobel Prize. He made a decision as a young writer in the 1920s to write in Icelandic. He knew that it would be easier for him to become a professional writer if he wrote in Danish. And he had already started publishing short stories written directly in Danish, in Danish newspapers. But then he somehow realized that for him to really be able to tell the stories that he needed to tell, he had to tell them in the language of the people he was writing about. And that's the beginning of modern, contemporary Icelandic literature. So it's only 100 years since we let go of oral storytelling or literature that you can talk about as folk literature or something like that. Yeah, and I grew up on the Icelandic folk tales and discovered the Icelandic folk tales as an eight-year-old and became absolutely fascinated by them. And for me, the adventure of reading those crazy, strange stories of dead people, like, you know, wandering around with their head under their arm, and all sorts of creatures on the beaches snatching people and coming from lakes, and creatures coming out of the mountains, you know, and all that. I mean, it's all very dangerous and very much about, you know, the eating of people.
Always a great subject.
That's always a good hook. That's always a good hook. You know, the fascinating thing for me as an 8-year-old was the fact that this was always presented as something real, something that had really happened. You know, there was no limit between, there was no border between what you could call fantasy and the absolute harshness of the real life. So maybe that is the reason why many Icelandic authors feel very comfortable going back and forth over those borders in the same literary work. You know,
because it does seem comfortable. It's very interesting to see what people have written about your book. You know, if they come from other traditions, they try to label it like with magic realism or something, but that hasn't really got anything to do with it. That's sort of a reinvention of something out of the blue. But this has, to my mind, obviously much deeper roots and a much more natural source of storytelling to it. It's not an artifact in that sense.
No, I think it's really a very old, cultivated way of describing the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And if you look at the sagas, you have the same thing going on there.
Yeah.
On the surface, they are realistic stories about disputes between people, you know, who are, you know, solving them sometimes in very brutal way by killing each other and all of that, burning whole families like inside houses and things like that, you know. But the amazing thing about the sagas is that the world view that you have there is that it's a holistic world where on one level you have the have the world of man with all the disputes and love stories and revenge and coming of age and all of that, and then you have that on one level. Then you have dreams, and dreams are just a natural part of that world, you know. And somebody dreams 3 horses running towards the mountain, and one of the horses gets like his feet breaks, you know, and everybody, when the dream is told, knows that okay, this dream is going to this dream will become real in the world of man. There's never a question about it. No. And then you have poetry. You have poetry interwoven with the stories. Yeah. And in the poetry, you have this elaborate, unique metaphor called kenning, where you bring different elements together to create the third. And the simplest way of simplest example is the road of Wales. Is of course the ocean. Yeah. And they can become very elaborate with 3-4 layers. Yeah. So, for example, the mercy of the fishes of the valley. What is the mercy of the fishes of the valley? It is the sun. Because the fishes of the valley are man. We are the fishes who live in valleys. And our mercy is the sun, you know. So it's an amazing system of metaphors that they use. And many and maybe most of those metaphors have references to the old pagan religion. So in the metaphors, you bring together the world of man and gods, you know. So you have so many different ways of presenting the world that we live in. And today, I mean, when Gabriel García Márquez started doing it in Colombia, it got this name, magic realism. Yeah. And we always say that when 100 Years of Solitude was published in Iceland, that for Icelanders it was just a reminder that we actually discovered magic realism.
Of course you did.
Yeah. So we just
you did.
Thank you, Mr. García Márquez, for reminding us that we already did this. You know. Yeah. No. So I mean, so I think it is a long tradition, and it is really something that is. It's a long tradition, which means that it has been cultivated in the way we tell stories over centuries. You know.
But with all this in the back of your mind, what were your thoughts about using these modern genres? Well, love story is not a modern genre, but the love story, the crime story, and the sci-fi. How seriously did you take those genres?
I take them very seriously because they are among the oldest genres in literature. And literature before it became intellectualized in a way and made serious, it always relied on different genres. You know, I mean, the Bible is nothing but a collection of stories in different genres. You know, I mean, you have the apocalypse there, which is science fiction. You know, and you have all the love stories. You have the tragedy of the rebel who dies for his cause. You know, I mean, you have all the genres in the Bible. You know, so all the great old literatures are what later became genres. You know, I think the writers of the Bible, you know, if they would step forward today, they would be writing Game of Thrones and stuff like that. You know, they would like to write something that actually reaches people. You know, and that there is some energy and fun in it. You know, and drama and all of that. You know, so
and there's a lot of all that stuff in this book.
In my book, it's all. And we haven't talked about what the book is about. Actually,
no. We sort of we're warming up to that.
So the first book starts in northern Germany in the Second World War. And the story moves from there to Iceland in the years 1944 to 1962, and the third takes place in Iceland 1962 to more or less 2012, and from there into the future. The first book has as a main character a young chambermaid working in a guest house in this northern Germany town called Kückenstadt. Kückenstadt.
Very nice name.
Yes. Yeah. Her name is Marie-Sophie. Mm. And she gets the task of taking care of a very ill, badly treated man who is actually a survivor of the death camps. Yeah. We don't know exactly which death camp, but he's coming from that, and there are some good people trying to get him out of Germany because he has a precious thing with him in a hat box, and this needs to be brought out of the hell that Europe has become, and especially the part of Europe dominated by the Third Reich. Yeah. And this man, his name is Leo Löwe, he carries the story onwards into the second volume. And we get to see what happens if you come to Iceland in 1944 when the whole population is completely self-occupied because it has just become an independent nation by breaking off from Denmark. And he has this strange experience of having just survived one of the most horrific situations known to human history, but there is no interest, there is no patience with his story. So the second book is about someone being denied his story, being denied telling his story. And the offspring of this chambermaid, Marie-Sophie, and the Jew Leo Löwe is Joseph Löwe, the narrator, who then takes the stage in the third book, or is supposed to do it. And you will have to read the book and see how well he tells his own story after having been quite a good teller of the story of his parents.
And also a very good teller of his own story, we might add, without giving too much away. It's imagination plays a big part in this. The name Löwe, could you explain where that comes from? Because that's not an accidental name that comes up here.
No.
Nothing is accidental.
Names of characters in books are always a choice, of course, you know. So, but it comes to they come to us in different ways, you know. And the roots of this book is a story that I like to tell. So if you've heard it before, bear with me. The roots of the whole work is in a visit I made to the Jewish cemetery in Prague in the summer of 1990. I went there with an Icelandic group, the Sugar Cubes, who were playing a concert, a benefit concert organized by Olga Hafel, the wife of the great playwright and first president of the new Czechoslovak Republic. Yeah. And I went there with them as a friend of the band, you know. And I knew the story of the Golem, which is one of the great legends of Prague. Prague is, of course, like one of the most magical places on earth when it comes to literature and stories.
And natural science.
And natural science, of course, yes. Let's not forget that. And the Danish contribution. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that was just
a
national Freudian slip.
I knew you needed that.
Yeah, I needed that. Yeah, it's all been about Iceland. Yeah.
So, knowing the story of the golem, this man of clay that was created in the Jewish ghetto in the days of Rudolf II, this creature of clay that's for a while was the protector of the ghetto before it outgrew its creator and became dangerous. This story I knew quite well, and I also knew the novel Der Golem by Gustav Meyrink, one of the contemporaries of Kafka, actually, a little bit older. Maybe one of he was of a generation. There was also Leo Perutz, and this was a generation that worked with a fantastic in the writing. He wrote a very strong novel called Der Golem, where he used this story. So I went to the Jewish cemetery, which is a one of a kind in this world, because the Jewish population, they were of course in the ghetto, and the cemetery, they were only given this specific place for the cemetery, and they were not allowed to bury people anywhere else. So they started bringing in earth to the cemetery, and the cemetery started growing, because they buried people on top of one another, and the cemetery has now become like this hill in the city, with gravestones like placed one in front of another, and all these people down, you got like this. It's a very strong experience just being there. Yeah. So I went to the Jewish cemetery, and I had one purpose, and that was to visit the grave of Rabbi Löwe, who was the creator of the golem in the legend. But he was also one of the wise men of Jewish culture, great educator, and a man who promoted education very early on as one of the survival tools for the Jewish people. So I went to his grave, and I saw that people were putting stones on the grave, and they were writing notes to the rabbi and putting into the grave, asking him favors and sort of prayers to the great rabbi. So I thought, well, I will do this too. And at the time, I had a little problem with my then girlfriend, and I thought I will ask him to solve this little problem for me. And because I'm a very well brought up man, my mother brought me very well up.
I can imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought I cannot ask him for a favor, without offering something instead. So I wrote, could you please solve this problem for me? If you do, I will bring your golem to Iceland. I rolled it up, put it into the grave, and I put a stone on the grave. A few days later, the problem was solved.
We won't ask how it was solved.
I will not tell you.
No.
But there is no body buried anywhere.
No, okay.
Okay. So I was all of a sudden, had this burden of doing my part of the fulfilling my part of the deal, and that's how it started. Yeah. And I started looking for a way of bringing this creature of clay, bringing this legend through literary means from Prague to Iceland. And I discovered that when I was 10, I read a boy detective novel about a man called Bob Moraine, who was an international man of mystery who traveled the world and fought evil wherever he went. And one of his main opponents was a Mongolian warlord and a genius of science called the Yellow Shadow. And the Yellow Shadow had found a way of cloning himself and using material to recreate his body whenever he was killed. this was very clever on behalf of the author, because it meant that whenever the yellow shadow was killed at the end of a book, you knew there would be another book about the yellow shadow.
Yeah.
Because he was, of course, a much more interesting character than the hero. And in one of those books, you know, in every book there was a small popular science section at the end of the book, explaining the reality behind some of the craziest ideas in the books. And in one of them there was a small chapter on the Golem of Prague. So I first read about the Golem of Prague in this book when I was maybe 9. And it said that a lamp of clay from the body of the Golem of Prague was still kept in the attic of the old new synagogue in Prague. So when I started working on my novel, I knew that there had been a lamp of clay, you know, kept there. And what is the most dangerous hour for the Golem in history? It is, of course, the persecution of the Jewish people and the attempt to completely demolish their culture under the Third Reich. So that somehow became the obvious starting point for the book, that this part of the Jewish history and culture needed to be saved and brought out of the continent in this hour of need. And that's where the story starts.
And this clump of clay is not just clay; it's also a human being in a way. So
it's a material for a new human being. And I don't think it's a secret. Is it? Are we giving too much away if we say who Joseph Löwe is, what he is? No. Okay. So, actually, the narrator of the whole book, Joseph Löwe, this man who is dying of this strange disease, he believes himself to be made of this clay by Marie, Sophie, and Leo Löwe at the end of the Second World War. But he himself is only born. He only becomes conscious in 1962. So there is a delay from the moment of his creation until he wakes up to the world.
So maybe it's the glimpse of all the nuclear bombs in 1962.
Yes,
that
and then we have that.
Sparks him off.
Then we have that, you know.
Yeah.
So what were the two biggest stories when I was growing up? The two biggest stories were the horror of the Second World War, and especially the death camps. And the second biggest story, which was the relevant story, was, of course, the nuclear threat, the atom bomb, you know. And it's very interesting when you. I mean, now, of course, young people have their own big threat to deal with. But when I was talking to my son, he's 20 now, when I was talking to him about the nuclear threat a few years ago, he just couldn't understand this. He just couldn't understand that all these people were really afraid of the world burning up in a nuclear holocaust, you know. He just couldn't understand it, because the idea of the atom bomb was completely, had completely disappeared. I mean, he couldn't even visualize, you know, the great mushroom cloud that we, all of us who are older, you know, just grew up with this image of the possible nuclear holocaust or nuclear apocalypse. So, and now they have their own apocalypse. You know.
But it's very, you know, when of course everybody remembers 1945 and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I had sort of forgotten all these gigantic nuclear test bombings that were taking place in the late 50s and early 60s, which was actually a lot of radiation was being spread all around the world at that point. And it was just sort of forgotten, because later they made treaties that made them underground explosions only. But at that time, they just sort of blew them up all over the place to try them out.
it's really amazing, you know, how many surface bombs were exploded, and how many atmospheric tests were made, you know.
Yeah.
And Josef Löwe is born on the 27th of August, 1962, at 11:05 in the morning.
Yeah.
And he is he's of a group of people in Iceland who are born during the time when the surface, atmospheric, oceanic tests reached their peak. From the 1st of April 1961 to the end of 1962, this time, what is it? How many months is it? It's a year and 8 months, 20 months. You know, was the peak of those explosions.
Yeah.
And so many of the explosions, especially the Russians, the Soviet tests were made in the far north. So this is when the radiation over the north reaches its peak as well. So that is also something that I'm using in the book, the possibility of mutation.
Yes, because
that people who were born in 1962 in Iceland, like myself, that we are actually some sort of mutants.
Yeah. Weird writers can actually be a result of heightened radiation.
Yeah. So maybe it has nothing to do with Icelandic sagas or reading the folk stories or anything. I'm just a mutant. Like Spider-Man, who was also, you know, he also came into being in 1962. The first Spider-Man paper, you know. So.
Well, but all the superheroes.
So all the writers before before 1962, they are just like, you know, guys who read the sagas, you know. We are just mutants, and we were brought up on American films and chewing gum.
Anything can happen there. Anything can happen. Yeah. But it is also a very beautiful part of the story, actually. This thing about we as human beings, no matter what happens to us, we actually have the freedom to invent a story about why it happened. You know, it might be that his disease is a result of his being exposed to radiation as a baby, who knows? But he has the possibility of telling it as a story, as a myth, and that I think is a very big part of the redeeming theme in your books, that there is this possibility of retelling your life as a story.
Yes, we all have our lives, and we all have the license to tell our stories.
What I found interesting, what you said just before about the yellow shadow, these
supervillain,
these supervillain stories about all the little science fun facts in the end, because in this book there's an immense amount of information that you might think was something that a crazy writer had invented, but whenever I looked it up, it turned out to be true. It's almost like an alternative history of modern culture and nature, just with some facts we are not usually presented with. Can you tell a little about the way you what do you incorporate and what do you leave out?
Well, let's say that on one hand you have an individual who is eager to tell his story because he wants his story to become a part of the great ocean of stories. And he knows that his story has to be told to become a part of the great tapestry or ocean or constellation of stories. And that's why he's so eager to tell the story. So he's an example of someone who uses the opportunity to do it and he represents all the people who never get to tell their stories, but also have the license to tell their stories.
Yeah.
And that also applies to all the facts that get lost, you know, all the strange facts, all the strange forgotten things, also all the ordinary things that you know are lost, you know, to eternity. So I think when you bring those two things together, you get a book like this, you know. Yeah.
But it's really amazing to think how much is left out. It's almost as if there is a committee somewhere that decides what are the important things that we then string together to tell the story of everything going from here to there. It's like a very, very small path through an immense ocean of events and facts and happenings.
Yeah.
So this is like it's like moving into an alternative universe, but it's real.
Yeah.
And it's been there.
You know, one of the benefits of being an Icelandic author is the fact that quite a lot of people in Iceland actually act upon this license that their stories can be told and that it should be told. So we have antiquarian bookstores and libraries full of books, autobiographies by ordinary people who just thought, okay, I'm going to write my story. And it can be, you know, a farmer's wife that nobody remembers anymore. It can be a taxi driver who was working, who was mostly working in the late 50s. He feels, I have to tell the story of how it was to be a taxi driver in the late 50s. And you have stories like, you have like compilations like My Mother, the Seamstress. So you have like 10 people telling stories, the stories of their mothers who all were seamstresses. Or My Father, the Botanist. So, okay, you have a whole collection of stories about a botanist, about botanists, you know. And so it makes things so easy for us, you know. So if I need to write about a seamstress or a botanist, you know, who was alive in the 1920s, I can just find that story, you know. And that's why you never have to invent anything.
Yeah. It sounds a bit like a modern publishing house. I think.
No, but it's true. You have an incredible number of those books.
Yeah.
Maybe you do also in Denmark, but in Iceland, you know, I mean, everybody feels that their story is important enough to be told. You know, so it's a battle against those who are like trying to say no stories about seamstresses. You know, they are not important to human history. But of course, then what happens is that an author, you know, decides to tell the story of a seamstress in the 1920s. And we realize everything that was going on in the world happened to that woman or was channeled through her story of working as a seamstress in downtown Reykjavik in 1923. You know, it's amazing. And so this book is also about that, you know. And he's using the opportunity to tie himself to world history. And of course it is true. We are all tied to what is going on, has happened, and possibly what will happen. Yeah.
Is there a small book somewhere about a young surrealist poet that used to be an air guitarist in a rock band and decided to write his own story and place it in one of those libraries?
Not yet, but I just trust. I trust that my daughter will be a part of the people telling stories in the volume called "My Father, the Air Guitarist." You know,
Sjón, I think maybe could you read just a little bit in Icelandic so that we can get a feel of what it sounds like really, and not in the this Danish.
Danish, wonderful translation by Kim Lambeck.
Yeah, it is.
It is. What can I read from this book? Maybe I should read something pornographic, you know. I could never read it in Iceland, you
It's
know.
always good, and in Denmark it's always very good.
Yeah. I can do it here because nobody understands it.
Mm.
Let's see. Where is it? So there is a description here of how this whole group of people were made. Nú fór í hönd tími mikilla samfara. Getnaður þeirra 4.711 barna, 2.410 drengja og 2.301 stúlku, sem lifandi fættust árið 1962. Nótt sem nýtan dag, kvölds og morgna, rúmhelga daga og á hátíðum, í matartímum og kaffihléum, reykpásum og frímínútum, fjallaferðum og sveitaböllum, í efri lögum samfélagsins, jafnt þeim neðri og ekki síst þar á milli, út undir beru lofti, þar sem dögg á grasi glóir, þar sem bjartar stjörnur blika, þar sem allt á floti allstaðar, þar sem fjalldrapinn grær, þar sem vegir liggja til allra átta, þar sem sól slær silfri á voga, þar sem stundin áfeng eins og vín, þar sem ágústnóttin hljóð, þar sem úti alltaf að snjóa, þar sem hagavagnin stoppar og þaðan sem hann fer, og inn í bílskúrum og íbúðarhúsum, skrifstofubygging og verslunarhúsnæði, verksmiðjum og útihúsum, skíðaskálum og trésmíðaverkstæðum, listaskálum og vörulagurum, dalakofum og heimavistum, fristihúsum og bensínstöðvum. This is a long list of places where people were having sex from the 1st of April to the spring of 1962. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's cheer for that.
Yeah, it wasn't that great. It says somewhere in the book, all true literature speaks as much to the body as it does to the mind. And this is like, listening to this, it is a sing-song for the body.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful language. Maybe that's why you're so self-conscious. You know, you've got such a beautiful language to tell stories in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I might ask you something about the just for closure here, the picture that the book paints of Iceland and Icelanders. What would you say were the gist of it? What do you want to say about Icelanders in this book? I know it's a big question because there, of course, there's a lot of stuff being said.
But there is a very simple answer to it. You know, we can have a whole other discussion about it, but the answer can be very simple. The picture of Icelanders drawn up in this book is not very flattering.
No, that's true. But we know that they got a lot on the plus account as well.
Yes.
Sjón, it says in the book that the biomass of the earth is constant. Everything that falls and dies becomes nourishment for that which is about to come. On the other hand, the biomass of poetry, of storytelling, grows. You know, early on you talked about the new threat that the young people have to master in the future, of course, all the climate change that you feel also, we know, very much in Iceland with the jökuls disappearing and stuff. But this is, at least to my mind, some kind of comfort.
Yes, there is a belief in the book and in me that telling stories, sharing stories is the greatest tool we have for survival. Yeah. It's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sjón.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.